August 29th marks a special day for fans of Michael Jackson and his music. For August 29th is the King of Pop's birthday, and to mark what would have been his 61st birthday, I thought we would make a brief journey through his musical legacy, looking at the albums he made both himself and also with his brothers, the Jackson 5 and later the Jacksons. Now some of you are already going to know all of the facts and figures, and some of you may not, but either way, I hope you enjoyed this little musical timeline of a journey. After their debut album in May of 1970, the Jackson 5 would release their second studio album, titled ABC. The album continued their meteoric success, selling nearly 6 million copies and reaching number 4 in the Billboard Albums chart and number 22 in the UK. It also contained two massive singles. The title track ABC came first and hit number 1 in the US and number 8 in the UK, followed swiftly by The Love You Save, which also made number 1 in the US and number 7 in the UK. Like their previous album, this record is noted for having a couple of covers on it, including one of Funkadelic's I'll Bet You, and the Supremes' The Young Folks. There is also a chance for Jermaine Jackson to shine too, with the song I Found That Girl, notably the only song on the album where he takes lead vocal as opposed to his younger brother Michael. As this was their second hit album, even more successful than their first, this would mean that ABC wouldn't be the group's only release of 1970. The third album, titled because, well, it is album number 3, their third studio effort was released only 4 months after the ABC album, in September of 1970. It has gone on to become the Jackson 5's most successful album to date, selling well over 6 million copies and peaking at number 4 on the US albums chart. 2 singles were released from the album, the first being I'll Be There, which peaked at number 1 in the US and number 4 in the UK, and the second was Mama's Pearl, which made number 2 in the US and number 25 in the UK. The album is notable for many reasons, the first being that with I'll Be There, it gave the Jackson 5 the unique distinction of being the first group to have their first 4 singles go to number 1 on the charts. It was close to being 5 singles, but Mama's Pearl just missed out by peaking at number 2. Covers are once again present on the album, the most notable being a bold cover of Simon & Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. Another song worthy of note is Going Back to Indiana, more of a self-biographical song and one that they would go on to play at many of their live shows. It's fair to say that 1970 was a monumental year for the Jackson 5, but it closed out with one final release. The Jackson 5 Christmas album was released in October of 1970, well before the holiday season. Despite this, it was massively successful. It has sold over 3.5 million units across the world, and certain songs on the album, namely I Saw Mummy Kissing Santa Claus and Santa Claus is Coming to Town, remain staples on the airwaves around Christmas time, not just in the US and UK, but across the world. So 3 albums in 1 year, that's tiring work for anybody. 1971 would prove to be the 5th studio album, Maybe Tomorrow, was released in April of 1971. Containing more ballads and upbeat dance tracks, the album still did very well, but notably not as well as the group's previous efforts. It placed at number 11 on the US albums chart, the first of their charted albums to miss the top 10, but it did contain 2 singles. Never Can Say Goodbye came first, hitting number 2 in the US and number 33 in the UK. Followed shortly by the title track, Maybe Tomorrow, which made number 20 in the US and will become their first single release to completely miss the US top 5 and top 10. This album continued the progression of a more original material made for the group as opposed to covers. However, there are still one or two dotted about for good measure, one being a version of 16 Candles, originally performed by the Crests, and a take on Honey Chili, which was originally done by Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. So despite this album not being as immensely successful as any of their 1970 works, it still managed to sell over 3 million copies worldwide, an impressive feat for any artist, that's for sure. The Jackson 5 would release two more albums in 1971, these being a soundtrack album, Going Back to Indiana, and a greatest hits compilation. However, for this little look back, I just want to focus on mainly studio albums or albums with a little bit of distinction. So onwards we shall go to 1972. January of 1972 would mark the release of not another Jackson 5 album, but the release of Michael Jackson's very first solo album. Got to Be There was an album titled after the successful lead single of the same name. The album would peak at number 14 in the US and number 37 in the UK, with several singles emerging from it. The first was the lead single, Got to Be There, which rose to number 4 in the US and number 5 in the UK. The second single was the much loved and remembered Rockin' Robin, which peaked at number 2 in the US and number 3 in the UK. The third single release was I Wanna Be Where You Are, which charted at number 16 in the US. And finally, the fourth single release was Ain't No Sunshine, but it only seems to have been a UK release, where it would chart at number 8. Michael's first solo album was a big success, selling over 3 million copies worldwide and containing some of his most memorable work of the early 70s. Other notable songs are, well, you guessed it, covers, as well as a successful rendition of Rockin' Robin and Ain't No Sunshine that are present, were also treated to beautiful interpretations of Carole King's You've Got a Friend and the Supremes' Love Is Here and Now You're Gone. Whilst nowadays I feel it often gets overlooked by a lot of Michael's albums as an adult, I would implore you to go and re-seek this debut work out. You won't be disappointed. Even though Michael had great success with his Got to Be There album, a few months later it was back to business as usual, as the sixth studio album by the Jackson 5 was released in May of 1972. Looking Through the Windows was another success for the band, reaching number 7 on the US album chart and number 16 in the UK. There were 3 singles taken from the album. The first, Little Bitty Pretty One, reached number 13 on the US charts, whilst the follow-up release, title track Looking Through the Windows, reached number 16 in the US. The third single was a UK-only release, Doctor My Eyes, would go on to be another top 10 hit in the UK for the group, peaking at number 9. This would be another million-selling Jackson 5 album, selling well over 3 million copies, and is in my opinion one of their best works across the 1970s. Covers are once again present, and it definitely becomes a running theme at this point, doesn't it? This time we have versions of Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, originally performed by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell, Doctor My Eyes, which was originally a Jackson Browne number, and Little Bitty Pretty One, a big hit for Thurston Harris. This album, if you listen closely, also starts to show off the vocal changes in Michael's range. This would only continue with the group's next album the following year. But before we get to that, we have to look at Michael Jackson's second solo album release, Ben, which hits shop shelves in August of 1972. The album would peak at number 5 in the US and number 17 in the UK. It contained one single, which was the title track, Ben, which would reach number 1 in the US and number 7 in the UK. The title track is a key moment in Michael Jackson's solo career, first being that it gave him his first solo number 1 in the US, a sign of the many more to come later down the line. The song was also the main theme from a movie of the same name, Ben, about a boy and a rat. I would recommend it, although in places it isn't for the faint of heart. The song also marks the first real occasion where a Michael Jackson work was nominated for awards. It was nominated at the Academy Awards for Best Original Song, which sadly it didn't win. However, it did win another prestigious award, that being the Golden Globe for Best Song. But despite all these successes both in terms of the Jackson 5 and Michael's solo career, the end of 1972 and going into 1973 often marks for many the initial decline of the group's popularity, which would only continue to wane until the group would saw the release of the Jackson 5's seventh studio album, Skywriter. This would be their lowest charting album in the US to date, peaking at only number 44. 4 singles from the album were released. The first was Corner of the Sky, which made number 18 in the US. The second was Hallelujah Day, which peaked at number 28 in the US and number 20 in the UK. The third single was a UK-only release, being the title track, Skywriter, which managed to climb to number 25 on the UK charts. The fourth and final single was also UK-only, being The Boogeyman, which only managed to reach number 58. Skywriter has managed to sell over 2.5 million units worldwide, but the apparent decline in sales of the Jackson 5 was now becoming more apparent. The boys by this point were touring extensively, so little promotion was done for the album, and they were starting to become frustrated with the kind of material they were being supplied with, whilst being prohibited also from recording compositions of their own. But one thing to note about Skywriter is more covers. This time around we have Touch, originally recorded by the Supremes, I Can't Quit Your Love, which was a Four Tops number, and finally Corner of the Sky, which was taken from the Broadway musical Pippin. Mere weeks after the release of Skywriter, Michael's third solo album was released in April 1973. Music and Me received little promotion due to Michael and his brothers embarking on a Jackson 5 world tour, and partly due to this, the album only made number 92 on the US albums chart. Some singles were released, but failed to replicate Michael's or the Jackson 5's earlier success. The lead release, With a Child's Heart, reached number 50 in the US. Morning Glow and the title track Music and Me didn't chart in either the US or the UK, and finally, Happy, which is one of my favourite tracks on the album, charted in the UK, but only peaking at number 52. Despite selling 2 million copies around the world, this is often one of the most overlooked Michael Jackson records ever. Again, it represents a time when Michael wanted to include his own songs onto his albums, but Motown waved the big old finger with a stiff and firm no. But seriously, give this album a re-listen. I'd be surprised if you were disappointed. Before the year could close out, the Jackson 5 found the time to release their 8th studio album, released in September 1973. Get It Together just about struggled onto the lower ends of the US album chart, peaking at number 100. Its lead single, the title track, Get It Together, managed to reach number 28 in the US charts. Its second single, Dancing Machine, gave the Jackson 5 another top 5 hit, as it reached number 2 in the US, but only number 53 in the UK. The album represented a much more disco and funk-oriented style than the bubblegum pop that the group has become known for. It's quite a cracking album actually, and considering disco wasn't mainstream at this point, songs like Dancing Machine really do stand out for the better. There are, of course, like any Jackson 5 album it seems, more covers. We have Reflections, originally by Diana Ross and the Supremes, Hum Along and Dance, originally by the Temptations, You Need Love Like I Do, originally by Gladys Knight and the Pips and the Temptations, and Mama, I Got a Brand New Thing by the Undisputed Truth. So half of this whole album is covers, eh? And Motown didn't want the boys putting their own original work on here? Sounds a bit convoluted if you ask me. Started with the release of Michael Jackson's 4th studio album. Forever Michael was released in January, and sadly is the lowest selling record during his time with Motown. Although still selling 1 million units, impressive again for any artist, it couldn't match what either he or his brothers had achieved only years earlier. The album peaked at number 101 in the albums chart, and had a few singles to try and back it up. We're Almost There reached number 54 on the US singles chart and number 46 in the UK. The second single, Just a Little Bit of You, reached number 23 in the US, just missing the top 20. Now the next song, One Day in Your Life, has an interesting story behind it. Even though it is included on the album, it wasn't released as a single at the time. However, in 1981, Motown released a compilation album of Michael's solo efforts with them, with One Day in Your Life being the lead single. Although only managing number 55 in the US, in the UK, it got to number 1. That's right, you heard me. A song that was 6 years old, from an album that didn't even chart in the UK, rose all the way to number 1, Michael's first in the UK. The album itself is still quite a joy to listen to. The first side alone has some true classics on it, and even though the second side isn't as strong for me, it's still a solid album. This, however, would be Michael's last solo album with Motown, and indeed, his last solo album for the next 4 years. But before we get into the latter half of the 1970s, there's still one more Jackson 5 album we have to have a look at. 4 months after Forever Michael, the Jackson 5 would release what would be their 10th and final Motown album in May, titled as Moving Violation. This album would reach number 36 on the US albums chart and sell over 1.5 million copies worldwide. 2 singles were released to try and support the record, the first being Forever Came Today, which reached number 60 in the US, though was a hit on the club circuit. The second and final single, All I Do Is Think of You, fared even worse, not charting anywhere around the world and only being a minor hit in US clubs. For their final album, Motown couldn't help but squeeze out one more cover for the group, which was the lead single, Forever Came Today, originally performed by the Supremes. This album is certainly less memorable than most of the Jackson 5's Motown work. It's not a bad album per se, but one that if you weren't bothered about picking up, I wouldn't blame you. And because it's one of the least successful commercial albums they did, it does mean it's a little harder to find in the wild these days. However, as 1975 drew to a close, the Jackson 5 would depart from Motown Records, all except Jermaine, who was married to the boss's daughter. So, the 4 remaining Jackson brothers, plus new addition Randy, ventured off. What would be next for this family powerhouse? The answer was Epic Records. After cutting a new deal with CBS and Epic Records, the now rebranded group, the Jacksons, released their first album for their new label, which was titled, funnily enough, The Jacksons, in November of 1976. It reached number 36 in the US and number 53 in the UK, becoming moderately successful. There were 3 singles that were issued to promote the new record. The lead single, Enjoy Yourself, was a big success in the US, reaching number 6, but only number 42 in the UK. However, the tides reversed for the next single, Show You the Way to Go. It only made number 28 in the US, but in the UK, it reached the top of the charts at number 1. The group's first time at the top of the charts in the UK, as the final single release was Dreamer, which charted in the UK at number 22. So for the first album under the rebranded name and the new label, the Jacksons could safely call this work a success. Leaving Motown could have ended their career as a group, and now with them being more grown up, their appeal as youngsters could have dissipated away. Thankfully, however, this was not the case. Furthermore, as well as receiving greater album royalties, CBS and Epic allowed the brothers to include their own compositions onto their albums, something they had been longing to do for years. The Jacksons had continued and in some ways reinvigorated their success, but could they keep it up? October 1977 saw the release of the Jacksons' second studio album for Epic, and their 12th album overall. Goin Places reached number 63 in the US albums chart, and number 45 in the UK. Sadly, the album is one of their lowest selling for Epic Records, but still managed over 500,000 units. The lead single, the title track, Goin Places, reached number 52 in the US and number 26 in the UK. The follow-up, Even Though You're Gone, only charting in the UK at number 31. However, the final 3 singles released didn't do as well. Different Kind of Lady and Music's Taken Over didn't chart anywhere, and with Find That Girl only made a small dent on the US R&B charts. This album, despite the boys making music videos for each single and some promotion on TV, kind of represented the weaker side of their Epic Records releases. It's still a lovely album to whack on, but there's nothing majorly memorable on here. Nothing as much, at least, as to what was to come next. If anyone was in doubt at the future of the Jacksons in 1977, then 1978 would turn those doubts completely on its head. Destiny, the group's 3rd album for Epic and 13th overall, was released in December of 1978. It peaked at number 11 in the US album charts and number 33 in the UK. This was to be one of their most successful and memorable albums ever, with massive sales of well over 4 million units, numbers they hadn't reached since the early Jackson 5 days. Some iconic singles came from this record. The lead release, Blame It on the Boogie, may have only reached number 54 in the US, but in the UK stormed into the top 10 at number 8. The second single was even more successful. Shake Your Body Down to the Ground peaked at number 7 in the US and number 4 in the UK. The final single, title track Destiny, may have only made number 39 in the UK, but by this point it didn't even matter. The Destiny album and its singles were able to re-establish the Jacksons as one of the best-selling groups of the late 1970s. The tour to promote the album was a big success, and even though they didn't have the Motown backing, by this point, they didn't really need it. For Michael, this newfound success and creative control, as Destiny was completely produced by the brothers, inspired him to create a brand new solo album, one that would go down in music history. August 1979 would see Michael Jackson release his 5th studio album, his first with Epic Records. Off the Wall was a music powerhouse, and a record that not only perfectly suited and showed off the highs of the disco age, but one that has been able to endure for the last 40 years. Half of this stellar album was taken for single release, the lead being one of the most recognisable songs of all time. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough rocketed to number 1 in the US, and just missing the same feat in the UK as it reached number 3. Rock With You was up next, also making number 1 in the US and number 7 in the UK, as well as being one of the best-selling singles of 1980. The title track, Off the Wall, made number 10 in the US and number 7 in the UK, whilst the ballad She's Out of My Life also reached number 10 in the US and number 3 in the UK. The final single, Girlfriend, made number 41, but again, like with Destiny, by that point it didn't even matter. Off the Wall was a musical success like no other at the time, selling well over 20 million units worldwide and being revered by critics and music lovers alike. Even to this day, many see it as his definitive album. Even songs that weren't singles are incredible classics. Working Day and Night would be a staple of Michael's live shows for years to come, and Get on the Floor feels like the ultimate disco song. Off the Wall also generated Michael his first major solo win at the esteemed Grammy Awards, taking home the award for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance for Don't Stop Till You Get Enough. Despite this major award, however, Michael wasn't happy. He had poured all his heart and soul into Off the Wall, and to only receive one trophy at the Grammy was viewed as a disappointment to him. He vowed with his next album he would sweep the board, make it impossible for anyone to ignore him and his success. We've got a few things to look at before we get there. Even though Michael had had immense solo success with Off the Wall, he was still committed to recording with his brothers. As such, in October of 1980, the Jacksons released their 4th studio album for Epic, their 14th overall, which was titled Triumph. Partly due to Michael's raised profile thanks to Off the Wall, Triumph did really well in the charts, peaking at number 10 in the US and number 13 in the UK. This success was also represented by its string of successful singles, the lead being Lovely One, a number 12 hit in the US and number 29 hit in the UK. The second single, This Place Hotel, reached number 22 in the US and number 44 in the UK, but would become a live performance staple for years for both the group and for Michael. The third single is probably the most iconic off the album, Can You Feel It? Oddly enough, it only peaked at number 77 in the US, however in the UK it gave them a top 10, finishing at number 6. Single number 4 from the Triumph album was Walk Right Now, another weak performer in the US, only reaching 73, but another top 10 hit in the UK, peaking at number 7. The Triumph album, as well as boasting some quality songs, also was backed up by a successful American tour. This tour in particular also got a double album release in 1981 as The Jacksons Live. It showed off the entire setlist, showing that not only were Jackson hits old and new included, but also a wealth of Michael's recent solo material. This live album would sell over 2 million units, one of the most successful live albums of the era, and definitely worth picking up if you come across it. But even though Triumph was another roaring success for the Jacksons, Michael once again turned his attention to his next solo project, which ultimately would be both his biggest and most successful. What is there to say about Michael's next album that hasn't already been said? Released in November of 1982, Michael's 6th solo album, Thriller, was unleashed onto the public. The album was an amazing success, peaking at number 1 on the albums chart in both the US and UK, Michael's first to do so. And as for singles, well, 7 of the 9 tracks would go on to great success. The first was The Girl Is Mine, a duet with Paul McCartney, which would reach number 2 in the US and number 8 in the UK. Followed swiftly by one of, if not Michael's most iconic song, Billie Jean, which was a number 1 hit in both the US and the UK. Michael's 4th number 1 in the former, and 2nd in the latter. My personal favourite of all Michael's songs, Beat It, was released next as a single. This too peaked at number 1 in the US and number 3 in the UK. Next was Wanna Be Startin' Something, which went to number 5 in the US and number 8 in the UK. Single number 5 was Human Nature, which raced to number 7 in the US and number 62 in the UK. Pretty Young Thing became the 6th single release, which reached number 10 in the US and number 11 in the UK. And last but not least, the title track itself, Thriller, became the 7th single of the album to reach the top 10 in the US, peaking at number 4 and also making number 10 in the UK. To have 7 top 10 singles off a 9-track album is incredible enough, but in February of 1984, Michael finally got what he desired in terms of the Grammy Awards. The Thriller album and its tracks swept the board, giving Michael 7 awards that night. He was on top, untouchable, unbeatable. The album Thriller has gone on to become the best-selling album of all time, a title it still holds to this very day, over 35 years since its original release. Even the 2 tracks that weren't singles, these being Baby Be Mine and Lady in My Life, have their own followings amongst fans and music lovers. A lot of people actually cite this record as the perfect album, and considering how long it would dominate the charts on the album side and through its 7 very memorable singles, it's hard to argue with that. Also during Thriller's reign, the advent of the music video began to expand in a way unseen before, particularly with the 14-minute music video for the title track Thriller that was more like a horror film. Michael broke brand new ground, leaving everyone to play catch-up ever since then. A monumental, unprecedented, unbeatable achievement was the album Thriller. That many people begged to ask, what was next for Michael Jackson? Well, the first clues to this answer would be unveiled in 1984. Motown, the label that first hosted the Jackson 5 and Michael Jackson's early solo works, decided it wanted a piece of the Michael success story that had first started unfolding with the release of Thriller in late 1982. They did this by releasing an album. In May of 1984, Farewell My Summer Love was released with the fanfare that is recently discovered music, when in reality it was a selection of cuts and demos that hadn't been released back in the 70s and was slightly spruced up to sound a little more 80s and slapped all into one album. It was quite a success in the UK, where the album peaked at number 9. 2 singles would emerge from the release, the first being the title track, Farewell My Summer Love, which reached number 38 in the US, but was a top 10 hit in the UK, peaking at number 7. The second and final single was Girl You're So Together, which didn't chart in the US, but did reach number 33 in the UK. Farewell My Summer Love, in my view, is a sort of underwhelming album. Not to say that any of the songs are bad per se, but some of them do leave a lot to be desired. One for the more diehard fans, I'd say. If you just want to stick to his regular stuff, then I wouldn't blame you. In July of 1984, Michael would return with his brothers one final time to release their 5th album as the Jacksons for Epic, and their 15th overall, Victory. The 8-track album was a roaring success, selling over 7 million units worldwide and also reaching number 4 in the US and number 3 in the UK albums charts. It was supported by 3 singles, the lead being a duet with Rolling Stones member Mick Jagger. State of Shock reached number 3 in the US and number 14 in the UK. The follow-up release was Torture, which placed at number 17 in the US and number 26 in the UK. Finally, there was Body, which peaked at number 47 in the US and number 94 in the UK. Victory for me is one of, if not the best Jackson album. Each of its 8 tracks have been carefully composed and placed along the album, it all flows together and there are some true standouts, such as Torture, which is the album's opener, and the beautiful ballad led by Michael, Be Not Always. Overall, Victory is highly recommended if you haven't listened to it or if you don't own it. This, however, would be the last album that Michael would take full part in as a member of the Jacksons. There was one more album released under the brand name, which was 2300 Jackson Street in 1989, and Michael does appear on one track, the title track itself, which was a single, but it only made a small dent in the UK charts, peaking at number 76. 2300 Jackson Street itself is a massively underrated album that, again, I would highly recommend if you haven't listened to it in full. So with Michael seemingly wanting to break away from his brothers for good, what would his next solo efforts bring to the table? After years of waiting and speculation as to what new music was to come, Michael finally gave us the answer in August of 1987 with his 7th studio album, Bad. Just like Thriller before it, the album raced to the top of both the US and UK charts, peaking at number 1. And like Thriller, also, nearly all of its tracks would become major hit singles. Out of the 11 available tracks, 9 were issued eventually as a single release. The lead single to promote the album was I Just Can't Stop Loving You, which topped both the US and UK singles chart at number 1, making this Michael's 6th US number 1 and his 3rd UK chart topper. The second single release was the title track, Bad, which again hit number 1 in the US and number 3 in the UK. Shortly afterward was The Way You Make Me Feel, which was Michael's 3rd consecutive US number 1 off the album and another number 3 hit in the UK. The fourth single, Man in the Mirror, also hit number 1 in the US and number 2 in the UK. Dirty Diana, the Bad album's 5th single, was also the 5th to place at number 1 in the US and made number 4 in the UK. The string of number 1s was broken by the 6th single release, which was Another Part of Me, which made number 11 in the US and number 15 in the UK. The 7th single, Smooth Criminal, returned Michael to the top 10, finishing at number 7 in the US and number 8 in the UK. The 8th single was actually the bonus track on the CD version of the album. Bolstered by a strong music video from the movie Moonwalker, Leave Me Alone wasn't released as a US single, however it was successful in many other territories and peaked at number 2 in the UK. The 9th and final single also didn't chart in the US, but the song, Liberian Girl, did place at number 13 in the UK. So to say that the Bad album was a successful follow-up is an absolute understatement. To have 9 singles that were all major hits was something, but 5 US number 1s in a row was absolutely unheard of, and wouldn't be matched until decades later. If Thriller established Michael as one of the greats, Bad would solidify it, and in my opinion, I believe Bad is superior to Thriller as an album on the whole. The sequence of songs is arranged to perfection, and their corresponding videos will forever stick in your mind once you've seen them. Amazingly, despite all of this and the record itself selling tens of millions of copies, Bad was in some ways snubbed at the Grammy Awards, just as MJ believed Off the Wall had been nearly a decade prior. Thriller had scooped 7 awards, Bad on the other hand only scooped 2. In 1988, the album won Best Engineered Album, and in 1990 won Best Short-Form Music Video for Leave Me Alone. Despite the underwhelming Grammy performances, however, Michael was still firmly riding the wave he had created with Off the Wall and expanded with Thriller. With Bad and its internationally successful world tour, he concluded the 1980s as not just a great entertainer, but something more, the King of Pop. So how would the King hold his reign over the incoming 1990s? November 1991 saw the release of Michael's 8th studio album and his first of the 1990s. Dangerous was released to massive success, once again peaking at number 1 on both the US and UK albums chart, just like Thriller and Bad. Out of the 14 tracks, 9 were selected for release as singles. The lead release, Black or White, was a smash hit, reaching number 1 in both the US and UK, making it Michael's 11th number 1 in the US and 4th number 1 in the UK. The follow-up was Remember the Time, which peaked at number 3 in both the US and UK. In the Closet was next as a single, racing to number 6 in the US and number 8 in the UK. The fourth single was Jam, which placed at number 26 in the US and number 13 in the UK. Who Is It, a personal favourite of mine, was chosen as the 5th single, peaking at number 14 in the US and number 10 in the UK. Soon to be a charity of the same name, Heal the World was single number 6, placing at number 27 in the US and number 2 in the UK. Give In To Me was the 7th single, and though it didn't chart in the US, was very successful in the UK, peaking at number 2. The penultimate 8th single was Will You Be There, which was another top 10 for MJ in the US and UK, placing at number 7 in the former and number 9 in the latter. Finally, the 9th single, a loving tribute to Ryan White, Gone Too Soon, didn't chart in the US, but placed at number 33 in the UK. So I think it's fair to say Michael Jackson had done it again once more. He crafted an album full of tightly composed songs that all flow together, and with many of them going on to be successful in their own right. Black or White has become a timeless anthem for racial equality. Heal the World has the same, but for global harmony. And even non-single releases, such as the title track Dangerous, has gone on to have one of the most iconic pieces of choreography associated with Michael Jackson. The world tour to support the album also was immensely successful, and even after all the singles had been released, Dangerous had undoubtedly earned its place amongst Michael's back catalogue, and to help him continue his undisputed reign as the King of Pop. Dangerous itself has sold over 32 million copies worldwide, slightly more than Bad, which was around 30 million. Michael had entered the 1990s ready for change, and he had succeeded, so for his next effort, he would be ready to do so once again. Despite the last few years of his life being fraught with horrendous allegations and damning media coverage, Michael pressed on with his career and would release his 9th studio album, History, Past, Present and Future Book 1, in June of 1995. Like his previous 3 albums, History raced to the top of the albums charts in both the US and UK at number 1. Several singles off the album were released, the first being a double A-side of songs, Scream, a duet with Sister Janet, and personal song Childhood. The release peaked at number 5 in the US and number 3 in the UK. Next up was the ballad You Are Not Alone, which topped both the US and UK charts at number 1, Michael's 12th solo number 1 in the US and 5th number 1 in the UK. Single number 3 was Earth Song, which didn't chart in the US but did place at number 1 in the UK, Michael's 6th in the territory, and also the Christmas number 1 for 1995. The 4th single was They Don't Care About Us, which placed at number 30 in the US and number 4 in the UK. Finally, the 5th single was Stranger in Moscow, which only peaked at number 91 in the US, but reached number 4 here in the UK. History, looking back at least, is a very interesting album. So much of the newer material is filled with the paranoia and anger that Michael has built up towards the tabloid press, as well as certain figures in the justice system, such as Tom Sneddon in the song DS. But despite this, History's new songs are still brilliant. Even those once again that weren't single releases, such as the wonderful Too Bad or This Time Around. Give History another re-listen with the context in mind and you'll have a much more fulfilling experience. Once again, Michael embarked on a world tour to help promote the album, which sadly would prove to be his last. When the tour concluded in 1997, the new millennium was fast approaching. Michael would without a doubt have to reinvent himself again if he wished to stay relevant in the increasingly faster world of pop music. But just as he was for the 1980s and 1990s, he was ready for it, and waiting to grip it with both hands. Before all that, however, there was time for one little extra. During his time on the History World Tour, Michael found some space to record some new songs that would be released on what would be his first remix album. Released in May of 1997, Blood on the Dance Floor, History in the Mix was a combination of 5 new songs as well as 8 remixes of songs from the History album. The remix album itself rocketed straight to number 1 in the UK, but oddly enough made only number 24 in the US. 2 singles were issued to promote the new album. The first was the title track, Blood on the Dance Floor, which although only reached number 42 in the US, would become Michael's 7th number 1 in the UK. The second release was a double A-side, a remixed version of the song History, and the new song, Ghosts. It didn't chart at all in the US, but did peak at number 5 in the UK. Blood on the Dance Floor is definitely an oddity amongst all of Michael's albums. Despite it becoming the best-selling remix album ever, it was often unknown to a lot of American fans at the time, as it didn't do well in the territory. The 5 new songs were all excellent, especially the more horror-themed efforts like Ghosts and Is It Scary. The 8 History remixes are interesting. Some of them, like the mix of History, Too Bad and This Time Around, I love. But then others, like Of You Are Not Alone and Earth Song, I can really do without. So despite a mixed response in his native US, Michael was still very much a success around most of the world, and he hoped to continue that legacy as the 2000s loomed ever closer. "2001 marked the year Michael would release his 10th studio album, and sadly his final album before his death. Nevertheless, released in October of 2001, Invincible would go straight to number 1 in both the US and UK, the star power of the King of Pop still well and truly around. 3 singles were issued from the 16-track album. The first was You Rock My World, which placed at number 10 in the US and number 2 in the UK, followed swiftly by Cry, which didn't chart in the US but did reach number 25 in the UK. The third and final single, Butterflies, only charted in the US, peaking at number 14. To say Invincible didn't reach its full potential is an understatement and a half. The album wasn't promoted nearly as much as Michael's previous work, which led to him having a dispute with Sony, who owned Epic Records. A tour to promote the album was planned but abandoned, partly due to the horrific events of 9/11, which led many an artist to cancel their planned world tours. The performances of the singles, although starting strong with You Rock My World, did trail off fast, and despite selling over 10 million copies, Invincible by some is still seen as a failure, and I couldn't disagree more. Even though yes, there are a lot of ballads, some not to my taste such as Heaven Can Wait and Break of Dawn, there are some true winners, like Speechless and The Lost Children. Great bangers like Heartbreaker, 2000 Watts and Privacy. Honestly, just re-listen to the whole thing and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. Sadly, as said, this would be the last full studio album before Michael's untimely death in 2009. But we still have a few little things to cover before we get there. Now I know I said I was staying away from compilation albums, but this one has a little distinction. November of 2003 saw the release of Number Ones, a collection of MJ tracks that supposedly had the number one honour, though when looking at the track list this is up for debate. However, the album reached number 1 in the UK and number 13 in the US, and the distinction I mentioned is that a brand new song was packaged with the album and released as a single. One More Chance sadly wasn't a hit in the US, only managing number 83, but it was a top 10 hit in the UK, peaking at number 5. Whether or not Number Ones is the best Michael Jackson compilation album is honestly up to you for debate, but I thought as it had a single release, it was worth a quick little note. A year prior to Michael's death, his most iconic and best-selling album, Thriller, was repackaged and re-released to commemorate its 25th anniversary. Thriller 25 was released in February of 2008 and peaked at number 1 in the US and number 3 in the UK. Again, this on the surface just seems like a standard re-release, but again there is a little distinction. 2 singles were released to promote the album, both of them being reimaginings of songs from Thriller with contemporary artists. The first was The Girl Is Mine, remixed and featuring will.i.am. This version didn't chart in the US but did reach number 32 in the UK. The second single was a version of Wanna Be Startin' Something featuring Akon, which made number 81 in the US and number 69 in the UK. There are many highlights to Thriller 25, however these remixes are sadly not one of them. Pick it up if you're curious, but really just avoid them. A new decade has started. Michael Jackson has been dead a year by now, but despite this, there are several songs that have either been unfinished or unreleased. After signing a deal with the Jackson estate to release more of Michael's music, Sony quickly began working on the first posthumous album by Michael Jackson. Released in December of 2010, it was a smash success, peaking at number 3 in the US and number 4 in the UK. The album, Michael, would herald 3 singles. The lead single was Hold My Hand, a duet with singer Akon, which reached number 39 in the US and number 10 in the UK. The following 2 singles, Hollywood Tonight and Behind the Mask, did not chart in the US, but charted very low in the UK, at numbers 152 and 191 respectively. The album, Michael, is a mixed bag for me. I remember receiving my copy, Christmas of 2010, and I was over the moon with it. I loved hearing these 10 tracks that were previously kept hidden. Now with all the debate over some of the songs not having MJ's vocals, it's hard to view it in the same way. There are some winners on it for me, but it's far from what I would class as a definitive Michael Jackson album. But Sony wasn't done here. Another posthumous album of unreleased material would follow sometime later. May of 2014 would see the release of the second full posthumous album of Michael Jackson's music. Receiving much hype and build until its release, when Escape was unleashed to the world, it was an instant success. It peaked at number 1 on both the US and UK albums charts and would have a very successful lead single. Love Never Felt So Good, a duet with Justin Timberlake, would give MJ his first top 10 of the 2010s, peaking at number 9 in the US and number 8 in the UK. 2 more singles were released as follow-ups, though both far less successful. The first of these, Slave to the Rhythm, reached number 45 in the US and number 98 in the UK. And finally, A Place With No Name didn't chart in the US, but it did so in the UK, however only at number 172. As a whole, Escape is a far superior album to Michael. The songs sound more fuller, and just more finished compared to the previous album. Its 8 tracks are all fantastic to listen to in their own right, and it gave us a promising look as to what kind of material Sony could keep releasing in the future. However, since then, not another posthumous album of this nature has been released. So here we are, 50 years after the first release of the first Jackson 5 album. Where are we then in terms of Michael Jackson's music releases? Well, sadly we haven't had another proper album since Escape in 2014. We had the horror-themed compilation Scream back in 2017, we had the Mark Ronson's 60th birthday tribute mix in August of 2018, and Michael's most recent appearance on the charts came in July 2018 here in the UK and October 2018 over in the US. The song Don't Matter to Me, led by singer/rapper Drake, has a 1983 session tape of Michael as its featured artist. It's been wonderfully successful, peaking at number 9 in the US and number 2 in the UK. But as we stand in 2019, there is still sadly no word on a new Michael Jackson album. I'm still waiting for Dangerous 25, which should have been out 3 years ago, Sony, come on! But even if we don't get another posthumous album for years to come, one thing is for certain: Michael Jackson will never be forgotten. His musical impact across the last 5 decades is undeniable, and he was, is, and always will be the king of pop. Rest peacefully, Michael, from all the fans around the world.